Okay, I thought it'd be good for us, just as we start out this morning, for you all to kind of think back to maybe the very first time you ever had to run the mile in gym class. You remember this in elementary school, maybe for the presidential physical fitness test? Or maybe if you don't want to think back that far, just think about the last time that you had to run or do something physically exerting to the point where you just really couldn't do it anymore, till you were exhausted, till you were about to collapse. I actually thought about last week, instead of the more intellectual homework assignment I gave, which was just to think about a question, to give you the assignment of running as far and as fast as you could until you just completely collapsed from exhaustion. I thought that would be, if you guys had all just done this last week, you would be so mentally and spiritually prepared for the meditation on this passage this morning. It would just have an extraordinary impact. But we are a soft church at Fellowship Bible Church, and I am a weak man, so that request was not made. But even without that assignment in your mind, I hope you can imagine just the pain, the exertion, the screaming lungs, the burning legs, the feet feel like they're going to fall off of running. Because without that pain in your brain right now, nothing in this passage is going to make a whole lot of sense. They were looking at Hebrews 12, verses 1 and 2 as we continue our journey through Hebrews. And in these two verses, there's only one explicit command. Now, there's a lot of implicit commands, stuff that we know as we read, we ought to do this. But, technically, grammatically speaking, there's just one command in these two verses. That is to run. One primary command. R-U-N, 3 letters. Right there, the second half of verse 1, which is the heart of these two verses we're looking at here. Let us run with endurance the race that is set before us. With endurance. That means, with grit, with tenacity. This isn't a sprint that he's talking about here. This isn't a casual trot through the daisies. This is a race of endurance. And I have a feeling that this metaphor right here would really resonate with the people receiving this letter. And yes, it is a metaphor for the Christian life of faith. But that doesn't make it any easier. In fact, if the people receiving this letter had just been given an assignment to run until they collapse, that would probably seem like a relief to them compared to what the writer is calling them to here. We've talked quite a lot about this in our series so far, the challenges that is facing the community that's receiving this letter. They were a small group of Christians living in Rome, most likely. This tiny minority in the beating heart of this worldwide empire. They were under pressure from the Jews to go back to the synagogue. They were under pressure from non-Jews to conform to all their Roman cultural expectations. They were facing prison, our writer says, public shame, humiliation, the plundering of their property. All this stuff that Bruce listed off when he preached on that passage a few weeks ago in chapter 10. And all of that stuff just on top of all the normal cares and strains of life that every human being has to face in a fallen world. Personal sin, sickness, finances, relationships, aging, death. They had all of that. These are the challenges that they face. This is the race that is set before them, as the writer puts it there. And notice the passive construction in that verse. The race doesn't lie before them. It is set. It's important because the one who does the setting is God. The runner, just like in every official race, the runner doesn't determine the course of the race. The runner just runs the course. It's really the idea behind this metaphor. This race that is set before us is God's appointed course for our lives. The life that the Father calls us to live when He calls us to life by the Spirit in His Son, Jesus Christ. That is the race that these readers are called to run. That is the race that we are called to run as well. This command is not just exclusive to the readers of this letter. It is binding on every single person who chooses to follow Jesus. We too have a race to run. It just might look a little bit different for each one of us. For example, I ran cross country in high school for one season, freshman year. It was a terrible idea. If there's any kids in here that are thinking about running cross country, choose a different sport, all right? One of the things that we would do before every single cross-country meet was this walkthrough of the course. The team captain would get like a course map, And we'd get to the place where we were going to run the meet, and there we would just walk through the whole race, noting, oh, here's a key turn. Oh, this is a little obstacle here. Oh, this is where I'm going to make my move, is what some of the faster runners would be saying. But let me tell you, I absolutely hated walkthroughs. That's because I hated the races in the first place. A whole week long, I would just get so nervous, and the dread of these races would reach its climax right there in the walkthrough, and that's usually where, at some point, it would turn into actual sickness, like, physically. You mean I have to run up that, I would say, as we're looking at this enormous hill before the finish line? I have to try to run 2.5 miles at race pace and then grind my way up that mountain? It's going to be agony. It's going to be cramp city. I'm going to puke, right now, not even during the race, just looking at it. This is why I hated walkthroughs. I saw in all of its terrible detail the race that was set before me, and I wondered, where am I going to get the strength to run this thing? Well, as awful as these are, I would actually like us to do a little bit of a walkthrough right now. Before we get into the meat of this passage, before we get to really what is a thrilling pep talk from our running coach, I want us to appreciate the full strength of the challenge that lies in front of each one of us who has chosen to follow Jesus. The challenge that would make that one-time run till you collapse assignment look like a relief. Do you remember last week's homework question? The one that was a lot easier than that other assignment? It was this. It was a question. Where right now is God asking you to exercise faith? How is God asking you to trust Him? What is God asking you to give up? What do you see in the near future that you really wonder, can I handle this? And really what the question is designed to get you to think about is this. What is the race that is set before you? What hills can you see in the distance? What obstacles are in the path? And where on earth are you going to find the strength to run it? Let me give you some fictional scenarios here. These are, some hypothetical examples of what could be answers to this question. A walkthrough of sorts of what you might encounter on the race of faith. Example number one is a guy named Devin. Devin is 28 years old. He's been single for the last 3 years, and he would really, really like to get married. He's been on a few dates with girls from church and stuff, but nothing's really clicked. Recently, though, things have been looking up for him because he met this girl through a dating app who is just awesome. She is smart, funny, good-looking, everything he wants in a girl. They've been on a few dates. They've gone great, except for one little thing about her, and that is the whole Christian thing. She believes in God and stuff, yeah, but through some recent conversations with her, Devin has discovered she's really, really not too sure about Jesus. If Jesus really is everything He said He was, if Jesus really is the only way to know God, if you really have to live your life as strict as Jesus apparently said you do. Now, Devin does believe all of that stuff. He believes it to the bottom of his heart, and in his sober moments, Devin knows that dating this girl isn't right. He knows all the equally yoked stuff and all of that. And in a perfect world, he would be perfect. He would be equally yoked. But the world is not perfect, and he can't just sit around and wait for a perfect girl all the time, can he? I mean, he's already waited for years and years and years, and God hasn't come through for him yet. So how many more years can he wait? And so right here, Devin faces a clear choice, a choice ultimately that comes down to faith. He sees the race that God has set before him, and he wonders, how am I going to have the strength to run it? Or maybe you're more like the person in example number 2, who is, I'm calling Kathleen. Kathleen is a single mom. She's also a businesswoman. Real estate is her game, and she's good at it. She's not a wealthy woman by any means, but she does well enough to provide for her kids, and this last year especially has been a good one for her. But still, finances are always a concern. She's got to carry the weight of her whole family on her shoulders alone, after all. So when an opportunity comes up to potentially make a little extra cash, she's always going to look at it. In this case, a fellow realtor has mentioned to her a way that she could do some creative paperwork on some of her deals to just kind of slide just little bit more profit her way. It's nothing terrible really, just massaging a few numbers here and there to make a couple $100 on a deal that otherwise, all that money just would have gone to the state. And on a 6-figure real estate deal, who's going to miss a couple $100, right? Definitely not the state with their bloated multi-billion dollars budgets, she reasons. But for Kathleen and her family, that couple $100, that's new shoes for her kids, school supplies, music lessons for another month or two. So what's she going to do? Now, I should say, Kathleen is a Christian. She knows the right thing to do, technically. She's read the verses in her Bible about, honesty, equal weights and measures, all that stuff. She knows the race that God has set before her, but in this, littlest of decisions, she has to decide if she has the strength to run it. Example number 3 is not so much an ethical crisis, but a crisis, the kind of crisis that is just unexpectedly thrust upon some families. Jesse and Lisa have been trying for years to have kids, and finally, to their great joy, a pregnancy test comes up positive. They're thrilled beyond the belief, making plans for the nursery and everything. But there are complications, the doctor says. A rare disorder, not completely understood, but the child will not be normal, at least not normal according to the standards of society. In fact, after researching this condition a little bit further, Jesse and Lisa discovered that this little baby growing inside of her is going to take a sacrifice of time, of money, of emotional energy that they never anticipated. A sacrifice that really, right now when they're thinking about it, they're not sure if they're capable of making. Now, they're going to keep the baby, of course. I mean, the thought of abortion never even crossed their minds, but they're just scared. They didn't sign up for this. They're not ready for this. This isn't the course that they picked out for their lives, but this is the race that has been set before them. And right now they wonder, where are we going to find the strength to run this? Example number 4 is a man named Robert. Robert is a guy who really has it all, at least from the outside. He's got a beautiful family, good job, big truck, respectable handicap at the country club. But Robert also has a secret, which is an addiction to painkillers that's kind of been this dark refrain under the happy soundtrack to his life for the last decade. Robert manages, this addiction well for the most part. He keeps track of his money, hides the pills, hides the shame. But lately it's gotten worse. He's been taking more pills. He's been making riskier decisions. And in a shocking turn of mind for him, he has been toying with the idea of confession, of coming clean to his wife, with his family, the men's group at his church. He knows that God has not called him to live this lie. He knows that God calls him to be open with his sin, to seek forgiveness from those he's wronged and help from those who can give him help. He knows the race that has been set before him, but right now, at this point in his life, he just wonders, do I have the strength to run it? You kind of see the pattern here through all of these examples. I mean, this is just 4 examples. In this church, we could think of 400. 400 different individual crises or ways that God is asking each one of us to exercise faith. So where is it for you? Where is God asking you to exercise faith right now? And more importantly, how can you do that? This is why we have this passage in our Bibles. This passage is a word to weary runners. It is the earnest instruction of a coach who also sees the race that is set before you, who knows how difficult it is, who knows that his runners are flagging, that they're losing steam, the coach who so desperately wants to inspire you to run this race with endurance and cross the finish line to glory. So he writes a letter. The letter we call the book of Hebrews, the letter whose entire theme and purpose is summed up so beautifully in the verses before us this morning. How do we live the life of faith? How do we keep running? How do we resist the urge to turn back, to quit while we still can? Well, it's not by looking at your problems, the coach says. It's by looking elsewhere. 3 different directions, actually. Back, down, and up. Starting in verse 1 with looking back. Therefore, since we have so great a cloud of witnesses surrounding us. I'm going to stop there, and I'd like you to circle the word therefore at the beginning of the passage. Because sometimes when we're reading the Bible, it's really easy to just kind of rush over these connecting words like this and just get straight to the meat of the passage. But this is a case where we definitely cannot do that. This is an unusual word that the writer is using here, a word that would stand out to the readers of the original letter. It's a really, really strong form of the word therefore that I don't think there's really a great English equivalent for this. I thought maybe a good way to get it across would be to write the word therefore like in all caps or bold or something, therefore might get the intensity across, because what the writer is trying to show is that these 2 verses, 1 and 2 of chapter 12, are actually the climax of chapter 11, the conclusion of that glorious chapter of faith we've been looking at. We just spent 4 weeks, right? A whole month strolling through this portrait gallery of faith. Why? For what purpose? What was that all about? Well, the writer's going to tell us that right here, and he signals it with that thunderous word, therefore. He also signals that this is built off what came earlier by referring to the witnesses. Those are those heroes of faith whose portraits are hanging in that portrait gallery of chapter 11. And again, witnesses, it might not be the best way to translate that word here, because maybe a better word would be testifiers, something along those lines, because when we hear witnesses, most of us think, spectators in this context, in this context of the race. Like these are the people who are the audience, and all these heroes are just up there in heaven, sitting on the edge of their seat, watching us to think, is he going to make a good decision? Is he going to make a bad decision? What's going to happen? I just love the suspense. That's probably not the image that the writer has in mind here, because he's already used this witnessing word a lot in the previous chapter. And in chapter 11, this same word for witness always has referred to God's witness about humans, or his commendation of them. Him giving them the thumbs up. I witness that this person lived the life of faith, is what it means there. And here, I think the writer is doing a little bit of a shift with the same basic idea. These people are witnesses because God has testified of their faithfulness, and now, by their example, they serve as testifiers or witnesses of God's faithfulness. In other words, these witnesses aren't so much looking at us. The writer is calling us to look at them and ultimately have their faithfulness point us to look at God. They are witnesses, yes, but not of our faith, but witnesses of God's faithfulness. That's the idea here. This is why we must look at them, for this is one of the ways that we find the strength to keep running the race of faith. It's by looking back to the examples of those who already have. This is so important to remember, that none of us here is the first one to try to run this race. And when we look at others who are further along the course than we are, both the witnesses that we read about in chapter 11 and the great cloud of witnesses sitting around us in the room this morning, we find the strength to keep running. That's why there's this, that really strong exhortation earlier on in the letter that Randy preached about, for us to keep meeting together, to keep going to church, even when it's hard. It's because you need other believers, and believe it or not, other believers need you. If we're going to run this race with endurance, we need others who can show us the way, who can kind of help us set a pace, who can carry our loads when we're too weak, who can even lift us up when we stumble, or maybe just kind of give us a kick in the butt when they see that we're slacking off. We need each other. So when you're in the position of one of those people in the examples, when you are facing a crisis of faith, when you know the path that you need to take, but you don't have the strength to take it, you need to ask yourself this: have I tried to seek input from someone who's faced a similar struggle? We have an enormous amount of resources around us, and we need to take advantage of them. Like if you're one of the 4 people in the examples I gave earlier, you could ask, who else has run this race of singleness and stayed faithful? Who else has dealt with the financial pressures of being a person in the business world, or of being a single parent? Who else has walked the path of caring for a severely disabled child? How can they help me? You see what I mean? And now to the younger people who are in this church, you have a wealth of resources for living the life of faith sitting around you right here this morning. Have any of you ever looked for a mentor? Have you joined groups, like women's Bible study or the men's breakfast, where you can actually get some intergenerational input in your life? We're surrounded by a great cloud of witnesses. Let's look to their example. Let's follow their pace and run with endurance the race that has been set before us. So that's the first direction to look. Back to the great cloud of witnesses, both in the Bible, both around us right now. The second direction to look is down at our feet. Verse 1 again. Therefore, since we have so great a cloud of witnesses surrounding us, let us also lay aside every encumbrance and the sin which so easily entangles us. All right, we all know from the beginning, running is hard, right? Think back to that mile-long race in elementary school. It's agony. Well, I'm going to add one more assertion to that running is not only hard, running is even harder when you are not dressed properly for it. Okay, I remember one time in college, I was paid $50 cash to dress up in an animal costume and film a commercial for the Puyallup Spring Fair at Gasworks Park up in Seattle. I'm not joking about this. This was a real thing. This is actually a still shot from the commercial. It's still up on YouTube. I was shocked about this. I searched for it earlier this week. I can't believe it's still up there. I'm the guy in the pig suit next to the chicken that is playing a ukulele. So it's amazing what those birds can do without opposable thumbs. That chicken was a very good player. But anyways, the reason that I bring this up here is because there was this one scene in the commercial where the commercial director asked me to run up and down the hills of Gasworks Park in this pig costume. There's a line, and it's all to a song. If you watch it on YouTube, it'll change your life. But there's this line in the song where it says, and the pigs start a-running, so you need a running pig. It eventually ended up getting cut from the commercial, but man, that was one of the hardest things I ever had to do trying to shoot that scene. I was having flashbacks to high school cross country the whole time. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't see. These little baggy piggy pants that I was in were, limiting my stride to like 10 inches. It was terrible. And that is the image that I want you to have in your mind right here when you read the word encumbrance. An encumbrance is something that slows you down. It's something that gets in the way, that trips you up. And the writer says that sin has much the same effect, right? It so easily entangles you. It's like a big loose robe that would entangle someone trying to run back in the Roman days. It's not going to work. This is why we must look down. We must look down to our feet and ask, is there sin in my life right now that could be tripping me up on this race of faith? Or if not something that is necessarily sinful, something that's an encumbrance, something that is actually a good thing, but maybe has just taken on too much importance in my life, and it's distracting me from the life of faith. In other words, what unnecessary baggage am I carrying through life? Are there any sinful patterns that I need to break? These really are questions we shouldn't just be asking at a crisis of faith. We should be asking these on a regular basis every single day. And I'll admit it, the second part of that question, that is a lot easier for me to ask than the first part of that question. Get rid of sin. Yeah, I am all on board with that. I am firmly convinced of the destructive power of sin in my life. I'm going to repent. All right, I'm going to try that. But my encumbrances, my hobbies, my entertainment, my stuff, I got to consider slimming down on that stuff too? I know I'm not alone here, but we American Christians especially so easily find our homes and our schedules bloated with a whole lot of unnecessary stuff, stuff that requires maintenance and time and upkeep and money, stuff that slows us down on the race of faith, stuff that really we're too afraid to set aside. Yes, afraid, because ultimately setting aside an encumbrance is an act of faith. For example, whenever you're, hunting big game, like in the backcountry where you have to carry a big backpack with all your stuff on it, usually one of the last parts of stalking an animal involves removing your backpack. Okay? It's big, it's bulky. You're never going to be able to sneak close enough up to the deer, the bear, or whatever if this big backpack waving above the grass and everything. So you got to take it off to get close. But this is a risk because most of the stuff that you need is also in your pack. What if the stalk takes a little bit longer than you planned? The deer goes over the ridge and you got to go over the ridge after it. What if you get lost? What if you get hurt and you find out, I need my first aid kit, which is back in my pack? Or has happened to me and my brother-in-law 2 years ago. What if you're caught out in the open and a thunderstorm rolls in and you're getting drenched and you have a really nice warm raincoat back in your pack a half mile up the ridge? This is why getting rid of sin and getting rid of encumbrances is an act of faith. You have to trust that even without those things, even once you've given them up, even without the stuff that you look to for comfort or relief or meaning in life, even so, God will provide for you. My life of faith would be more robust without social media, you decide. So you cancel it up. You give it all up, trusting God instead to provide you with the relational connection that you need. Or even up the ante a little bit on the technology side of things. You decide your life of faith would be more robust if you got rid of your smartphone altogether. I'm going to party like it's 1992. You decide that's going to be my life from now on. No email, no GPS, no fitness apps. Yeah, that's going to be tough, but also no distractions, right? More stillness. Surprisingly, more time to just kind of stare out the window, think, pray. All the while trusting God to provide you with whatever it is you were looking for your smartphone to give you. Or a non-tech example. You decide that your whole family's life of faith would be more robust if you asked each of your kids to give up one of their sports teams or one of their after-school activities. Something. All the while that trusting that God will still make your kids into the people that He wants them to be without all that stuff that's bloating your schedule. You see how this works? These are really hard questions to ask. They are so important questions for us to ask as Christians in the United States. There's a very real sense in which Christians should be the ultimate minimalists. Of all the people in your neighborhood, those who most joyfully breeze their way through life in simplicity and freedom, because in Jesus, we've already been given everything. Don't try to run the marathon in a pig costume. That's what I'm trying to say here. Instead, set aside your sin, lay aside every encumbrance, and look to Jesus for what you need. This is the final direction that the writer calls us to look really up to Jesus, the one who gives us everything. Verse 2, let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of faith, who, for the joy set before him, endured the cross, despising the shame, and has sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Look at Jesus. That is what the writer calls us to do. Look at Jesus. Fix your eyes on Him. He's just led us on this breathtaking tour of faithfulness, that beautiful portrait gallery of chapter 11, walking us person by person, example by example, story by story by story, from Genesis 1, the creation, all the way up to the present, and the pinnacle of the tour. The last piece in the portrait gallery, the portrait that stands all by itself, alone, under a dazzling spotlight, is the portrait of Jesus Himself. Jesus is the premier example of the faithful life. That's the main point of these verses. That's the main point of these two chapters even. All of chapter 11 points to verse 2 right here. That's why the gallery exists. Yes, all those guys in the gallery, they are great. But the big theme of Hebrews, Jesus is better. He doesn't just have faith. He's the author of faith, or as it's translated in the ESV and the NIV, the pioneer of faith. I love that image. I just love it. That means that He's the first one to demonstrate faith fully. He's the first one to live a faithful life from beginning to end. He wrote that story, right? He blazed the trail. He went where no man had gone before, and He led the way for all of us to follow in His steps. That's also why He's also called the perfecter. Because in Jesus, faith has reached perfection, completion. It's pinnacle. Jesus is the only one in this marathon who can buy the t-shirt at the end that says finisher. right? He's the only one who can have that 26.2 sticker on the back of his car. And that's because he's the only one who was all the way faithful, comprehensively faithful, from birth to death to resurrection, everything in between. Jesus is the premier example of the faithful life. And this in no way minimizes all the wonderful examples that we see in those portraits of faith in chapter 11. It's simply that Jesus was better. In fact, every single one of their portraits points us to Jesus' portrait. You know, we read that by faith, Abel offered a better sacrifice than Cain. But Jesus was the better sacrifice. We read that by faith, Enoch was taken up so that he should not see death. But Jesus died so that all people should not see death. By faith, Noah built an ark of wood for the salvation of his family. But Jesus carried a cross of wood for the salvation of the entire world. By faith, Abraham was willing to sacrifice his one and only son, but Jesus was the one and only son willing to sacrifice himself. By faith, Moses led his people out of slavery and into the land of promise, but Jesus leads us to a greater promised land, the eternal rest, as the writer says, a rest that lasts forever. What more shall I say? We could go example by example here. In every way, the faithful life of Jesus is the example par excellence of faith, and it is on him that we must fasten our gaze. If you want to know what it looks like to live a life by faith, then look at Jesus, the one who is faith's author and faith's perfecter. I mentioned earlier how this metaphor of the race is so rich and it's so beautiful, and it is, but like every metaphor, it has its limits. Because unfortunately, there are no walkthroughs in the life of faith. You don't get to see the course that is set out before you in all of its detail. Usually you can barely see far enough ahead to know where to take the next turn. But you can see Jesus always and forever. And by looking at Jesus, you not only see the one who shaped the life of faith, you see what sort of shape the life of faith will take. In other words, Jesus is our walkthrough. Jesus is the premier example of a faithful life. So if we are faithful, we can expect our lives to follow the same pattern as the life of Jesus. And what pattern is that? First a cross, then a crown. Who, for the joy set before him, endured the cross, despising the shame, and has sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. You know, a variety of images might come to your mind when you hear the word cross. You know, maybe you think of a necklace, right? Or a medical symbol like the crosses that we see on hospitals. Or maybe you think of some decorations you've seen in churches or Christian bookstores or something. I'll tell you, none of these images would have come to mind for the original recipients of this letter. When they heard the word cross in verse 2 here, they would think of torture, they would think of horror, they would think of shame. I'm going to read a passage from an excellent Roman history scholar named Sarah Rudin, who really, I think, shows us what would come to mind for the readers in this passage. She writes, "Crucifixion was the pinnacle of Roman torture. For maximum humiliation and the maximum edification of others, crucifixion was very public. Crosses with their victims on them might stand beside roadsides where lots of people would walk, or on hills where everyone could see them. The crucified were totally naked, without loincloths. Anyone could point and comment and mock, which the Greeks and the Romans, with their intense focus on human anatomy, no doubt did. The families and friends could do nothing but watch, hour after hour. The victims died when they could no longer pull their shoulders back to keep their esophagus open and breathe. They were practically never reprieved. They might get a numbing drug or something to drink, or the leg breaking, a chop that might go straight through the shin bones to prevent them from bracing themselves from the footstand and surviving longer. Forsaken is the right word for the crucified. Go to hell is an apt rendering of the Roman curse, get crucified. It is about unspeakable suffering. It is about suffering that can extend into eternity. So that right there is the image that would come to mind for these readers when they heard this single word from the writer, cross. There's not even an article in the Greek text. No word the, it's just a cross. For the joy set before him, Jesus endured a cross. This is the path that Jesus chose. Not ease, not luxury, but suffering. This is really what I think the writer's trying to emphasize when he said that Jesus did this for the joy that was set before him. Not to obtain joy, not his, joyful motivation for the cross, though there is one. That's not his emphasis here. But instead of the joy. That's what the writer's emphasizing. Now, there's a lot of debate among scholars about, how to exactly translate that for the joy. I'm going to try not to get too lost in the details here because it actually is a very interesting debate just kind of on a grammar level. But I do think that the particular word that the writer uses when he says for the joy means instead of the joy or in place of the joy. You can kind of understand how this works. Like in English, we've got 9 definitions for the word for. One of those is to obtain. Like if I said to my wife, Shauna, will you go to the store for eggs this afternoon, right? That would mean I want her to go to the store and get eggs there and bring them home, right? Another definition of the word for in our culture is in place of. Like, Shauna, will you go to the store for me this afternoon? Right now there, I don't want her to pick me up at the store. I want her to go to the store in place of me or instead of me. And I think it's clear here in the text that by the particular word that the writer's using, he's trying to emphasize what Jesus gave up to go to the cross, not what Jesus gained from going to the cross. He did this for the joy, that is, instead of the joy. Instead of the joy that was set before him, he ran the race that was set before him, the race that led him to the cross. And if we run the race of Jesus, then that's where our race will lead us to the cross. One of the biggest reasons why people end up quitting and not finishing certain endurance events like, triathlons or marathons, something like that, is really because first-time runners didn't know what to expect. I didn't know how hard it would be, really. I didn't know the agony that I was going to be in at mile 20. I didn't know what was really going to be asked and expected of me in this event. That's why if any of you here are ever unscrupulous enough to bet on a marathon, I would put my money on the people with experience, those who've got a marathon or 2 or maybe 20 under their belt. Because realistic expectations are a key indicator of endurance success. This is so true of the life of faith, the ultimate endurance event. If you're someone here who has decided to follow Jesus, I want you to think back to that moment when you did. Think back when you decided, you know what, I'm going to go all in for Jesus. What effect did you expect that would have on your life? What did you think would happen when you did that? What effect did you think this decision would have on your finances or your comfort, your relationships? One of the real tragedies of American evangelism over the last century is just this kind of sugary marketing of Jesus as the pathway to an easy life. And I'm not just talking about prosperity evangelism, which, the prosperity gospel, which is probably the worst example and most extreme form of this. I'm also talking about just well-meaning camp counselors, youth workers, Sunday school teachers, pastors who have talked a lot about all the benefits of following Jesus, but very little about the cost. Here is the altar call of Christ himself. If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. Take up your cross. That is Jesus' invitation. Set aside your easy life. Set aside your dreams. Set aside your goals of self-fulfillment. Set aside every encumbrance. And instead, pick up this instrument of shame. Pick up this instrument of torture. Tie your own noose and follow me to the place of the skull where you will be stretched, nailed, hung, and left to die in very public agony. This is the invitation of Christ. Come, follow me, and die. Is that your expectation of the Christian life? If not, you will never run this race with endurance. Think back at our 4 examples from the beginning of the sermon. I mean, this could be part of the big disconnect for them. False expectations could be their problem. They simply didn't expect Jesus to ask them to give up so much. You know, give up my girlfriend for Jesus? That's a lot to ask. Give up all that cash? Give up my reputation? Give up my life as I know it? I mean, that's a lot to ask. I didn't expect this. Well, here, our writer would say your expectations were wrong, because Jesus doesn't ask you to give up a lot. A lot is still far too little. Jesus asks you to give up everything. Take up your cross and follow me. This is the race that is set before us. There is no path that involves following Jesus that does not lead to a cross. Not for Jesus, not for us. First a cross, and then the crown. But this is so important to realize that the cross is not the end of the race. First the cross, then the crown. Who, for the joy set before him, endured the cross, despising the shame, and has sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. You know, I love that little phrase that's just tucked away in verse 2 there, despising the shame. Now, this doesn't mean that Jesus hated the shame, like, oh man, this is so shameful for me to be on this cross. I hate it. No, it's almost the opposite of that, actually. To despise means to think little of or consider something worthless, like not even worthy of your attention. You know, like if you would despise a party invitation if you got it in the mail and instead just tossed it in the trash without even opening it. Or you could despise a beautiful garden by just kind of carelessly walking over the flower beds like you don't even realize that they're there. That is the same attitude that Jesus demonstrated to the shame of the cross. Yes, the cross was agony. Yes, the cross was enormous shame that was horrible to bear. And yes, Jesus knew this before he went there. We see that so clearly in the Garden of Gethsemane. But by faith, Jesus was operating under a totally different system of values, a different standard of measuring worth. And in his eyes, what lay in the future far exceeded the shame of the present. So he despised it. He considered all that shame without value. He shrugged it off, as it were, because he knew where all of this was headed. First the cross, and then the crown. First, the right hand of your enemy, driving a nail through your flesh. But then, the right hand of God welcoming you to the place of highest glory. This would be another one of those really powerful images for people in the first century world. That right hand, that was the place of highest honor. Like if you were invited to a banquet back in the day and the host said, hey, come sit down at my right hand, that would be amazing. That'd be a huge, huge honor. He's putting you at the same status as he is. And, so the greater the prestige of the person who invited you, the greater the prestige of sitting at their right hand. If you were invited by a wealthy merchant to do that, wow, that'd be a very high honor. The right hand of a military leader, even a higher honor. The right hand of a governor, a senator, the emperor. It's like the people, they wouldn't even have a framework for an honor that lofty. To sit at the right hand of the emperor of Rome would be glory almost beyond their comprehension. So what about the right hand of the one who made the emperor? What about the right hand of the one for whom the entire city of Rome, the entire empire, in fact, would not even be worthy to serve as a footstool for his feet? What about the one who spun the planets, who lit the stars, the one who sustains the universe by the word of his power? What about the right hand of the living God? This is why Jesus despised the shame of the cross. He was looking to the glory of the crown, the glory that has no equal, the glory that has no end. Not just for Jesus, but for all those who follow in Jesus' path. Jesus is the premier example of the faithful life. So, if we are faithful, we can expect our lives to follow the same pattern of the life of Jesus. First a cross,
then a crown. First the agony, then the honor. First the tomb, then the resurrection. First the shame, then the glory that is also without equal, also without end. This is the path of Jesus, and if we keep on following him faithfully, this is the path that we will walk. So do you believe this? I mean, really, do you really believe this? You really believe that your life is going to follow the same pattern as Jesus? Because if so, that changes everything. Back to our examples. If Devin really believes that his life is going to follow the same pattern of Jesus, first a cross, then a crown, he finds strength that he never knew he had. Strength to say goodbye to his girlfriend. Strength to go back to the single life, maybe even forever, because he is looking to something better. He's got his eyes on Jesus, and he knows that if the race of Jesus ended with a crown, then so will his. Same thing is true for Kathleen. When she really believes this, when she really believes that her life will follow the pattern of Jesus, first a cross, then a crown, she finds strength she never knew she had. Strength to say no to the easy cash. Strength to trust God for everything that she and her family needs. Strength to make do with less, maybe, because she's looking to something better. She's got her eyes on Jesus, and she knows that if the race of Jesus ended in glory, then that's where her race is going to end as well. Same with Jesse and Lisa, the couple that's expecting a severely disabled child. The race that has been set before them is so difficult. It's difficult than I can even imagine right now. But the glory that is waiting for both of them is also greater than I can even imagine right now. And if they really believe this, then both of them find strength they never knew they had because they have their eyes on Jesus. And finally, Robert, the man who is ashamed to admit his addiction and ask for forgiveness. Now, this is a difficult path for him. That confession of sin will probably feel like a cross for Robert. Like with every word that he's saying, he's driving that nail into his own hands. But after the cross comes a crown. And if Robert really believes this, if Robert really keeps his eyes on Jesus, he will find strength he never knew he had, because if the race of Jesus ended in glory, then so will his. So here's your takeaway for today. When you are following the path of Jesus, it is impossible to give up more than you will gain. I'm going to say that again. If you are following the path of Jesus, it's impossible for you to give up more than you will gain. You cannot do it. Yes, follow me to the cross, Jesus says. Give up everything. But that's also exactly what Jesus gives to us. Everything. Here's the full invitation of Jesus. If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. I'm going to close here with a story. It's a story that Jesus told in about 15 seconds that really sums up everything I've been trying to say for 45 minutes. The kingdom of heaven is like a treasure hidden in a field. When a man found it, he hid it again, and then in his joy went and sold all that he had and bought that field. May we go and do likewise by faith. Pray with me, please. Father, thank you for the treasure that is your Son. Thank you for the enormous hope that he gives to every single one of us. Thank you for the riches of his righteousness. Thank you for the hope of eternal glorification. Thank you for the hope of resurrection, of every wrong being made right, of every sickness being healed, every hurt in our heart being fully mended, of eternity in your presence in the new heavens and the new earth. Lord, that is a treasure we really can't even imagine. But by faith, we seek after it. Thank you, Father, for giving everything for us. Thank you for giving up your Son. I ask that by your Spirit, you would help us to keep our eyes on Jesus by faith. In so doing, run the race that is set before each one of us in joy and freedom. It is in his name that we pray. Amen.